Hello everyone, welcome back to Alkaline Hydroxide 784. Today we move on to a new theme, finding internships. Wait a minute, no that's not it. The actual theme is called A versus B. Which shall it be? See, it rhymes. Okay, go jokes aside. We will be seeing two different options with regards to one topic, which will actually make it more like a GP essay and not just me throwing some content at you. Okay, so today we ask overpopulation versus unequal resource distribution, which is the worst problem for humankind. Yeah, you can see I'm not really as good as question creation, but we will try to unpack this anyways. A few ways that we can look at this is through time scale and extent of world affected, the significance of impact, and how fixable or whether we'll actually fix it. So those are the four things we'll be looking at today. I will not really try to. I mean, I'll come to a conclusion after going through everything. I won't be actually structuring it like a GPS. You have to do that yourself. Okay. So the first thing we'll be looking at is time scale. So time scale is something that we hear about a lot in history. Like, oh, is it a thing now or does it affect you down the road? So we're looking at which one affects humankind more. So for overpopulation, it definitely seems like a problem right now in some countries with higher birth rates. But I'm presuming that over time, as countries seek development, birth rates will auto decline and we won't actually have a population crisis. The thing is, it is one of those things that kind of might self regulate itself. But one could argue that even the current population that we have is a lot. If you didn't know, there was once upon a time when the population was half that it was now, and then it suddenly became twice the amount in quite a small time period. So yeah, for that we have to consider then if the current population is too much, and that in order to figure that out, we have to see whether we are making enough resources for everyone. And if so, then resource distribution might actually be the real problem. Because as you can see, the transportation industry, while it is quite robust, it's also quite fragile to certain problems. COVID disruptions, mm, and also whether there's people available to deal with the increase in input and increase in output required, the supply and demand. And basically the supply points are quite fragile, and this is because of stuff like droughts, floods, fish getting killed by algae, temperatures becoming too high, and that prevents us from growing certain things in certain locations. Especially, I mean, of course I could say chocolate and coffee, but those are not necessarily the most needed things. But still, even more necessary things like certain grains may not be growing in certain temperatures, and also things like land getting overtilled because of location issues, etc., etc., etc. And this is where some smart Alex may try to convolute this further and say, in fact, it is because of overpopulation that we have pushed the limits of our resources and overtilled the lands and made temperatures increase and all that stuff. But honestly, I think doing that is a bit overthinking, like how I tend to be. So let's not talk about that. But the point is, I did say we have enough resources. I remember seeing something once upon a time that just said that we actually have enough resources for everyone. It's just that a lot of the resources are concentrated in certain parts of the world and not being able to bring them to the rest of the world. It's not being distributed to the rest of the world. And yes, to an extent, I can definitely say that we probably do have enough resources. It's just that some countries have more resources than others, and things just aren't getting where they need to. And that means that the resource distribution is the real problem rather than overpopulation. And if you're wondering, oh, what about the environmental impacts and all that? Well, I'm only going to look at its impacts on humans directly, and yes, through both of. Like, I think in this sense, since overpopulation will self-regulate, it won't really be as big of an impact in the long term compared to resource inequality or unequal resource distribution. So that's for the first factor. The second factor is the extent of world affected. So, as I mentioned earlier, the time scale, that's one thing, but you realize that there's a difference in different countries. The time scale goes at different rates for different countries. The quote unquote poorer countries generally face more problems with both of these issues. Well, there's a general correlation between a lack of resources and or development in a country and higher birth rates. And is it inverse correlation? Yeah, probably an inverse correlation. The reason being is that when there are lesser resources, humans are the primary resource. But ironically, making human beings and growing them to functional adults is also very energetically costly. So those in the poorer countries face higher child death rates and not a lot of entertainment options. I mean, TVs and electricity is quite costly. And they also need some labor to, because they're primarily agricultural societies and they need people to help around in the farm or to grow a herd. And this results in kids, a lot of kids. And of course, nowadays there are still many child deaths in some of these places, but as a whole, you still see an increase in population. So the countries could be having overpopulation problems in that sense because there's too many people and there's not enough resources. But overpopulation can also happen in another sense, and that is high population density. And yes, that can happen in a completely opposite kind of location, city centers. Why might this be a problem, you might ask? Well, when there's too many humans in one small city, there's too many buildings, too much electricity and water usage. This can cause certain problems such as the urban heat effect. And in this case, it actually does affect the humans as well. So, yeah, the urban heat effect because the buildings aren't very good at reflecting heat. It may be some local pollution or lack of trees, which can affect the health of the city dwellers, lack of water or electricity if a natural disaster occurs and fries the systems, and other such problems. And of course, this time round is not because there's a lot of birds. In fact, cities tend to have lower birth rates because there's not enough space to stay in, and everyone is quite wealthy and can trust that their kid will become an adult. So, just they prefer not to have more birds. And the real reason is because that many people choose to migrate to the city and gather in that one spot which has abundant resources or favorable climates. And why is that the case? Well, resource distribution doesn't necessarily need to be because of human forces. It can also be due to natural forces sometimes. So, for example, if there's a river, you can't expect the river to be everywhere. It's only in the place where it's going to be. And that is, in a sense, also unequal resource distribution in terms of the land area. People are then gravitating towards the area where the river is. Yeah, so in the end, is it overpopulation or is it actually just resource distribution again? hmm, that's up to you to conclude, I guess. Anyway, so that's the second point. Um, so like I mean to summarize this particular point, in poorer countries, yeah, it tends to be overpopulation and also a bit, but like this resource distribution makes it worse or kind of facilitates the problem. And in city centers, it can be resource distribution that caused the problem in the first place. Yeah, so there we go. So third point is on significance of impact. Okay, so let's see. If something affects a small but very important area, it is worse than if it affects a large but not very important area. So that's what I mean by significance of impact. All right then, what defines a very important area? Well, probably something with a lot of influence or a high population density. So the problem with this is that it is quite controversial to define who is the influential country or countries because it can be kind of discriminatory. Like for example, you say, oh, that well, US is very important because it influences a lot of world issues. It influences a lot of the things that happen in the world. And if there's a problem in USA, then everyone is in trouble. That kind of a situation. But in reality, we know that both of these problems affect the poorest and maybe least hurt countries the most. Why? Well, resource distribution is technically based on globalization. And in order to get sufficient resources, you need a network and you need the money. So, to understand what this means, we can look at two different examples. One is, of course, history, which is the economic history. Because if you've heard of, if you're a history student, you know about the fact that the so called First World were the most, profited the most from the economic boom, while the rest of the countries didn't have such a great time, as unless you're one of those thriving Asian economies and somehow managed to survive despite the fact that you're not part of the first world. Yeah, so that's the first example. So you do realize that even when there's resources, only some countries profit from the resources. And those countries end up being the influential ones, whereas the less influential ones don't get the resources and also don't get the voices heard. But let's look at something more recent and something more relatable. And actually, you've heard about this before as well, but not in GPO, but instead in my vaccine three-parter. In the third episode of that thing, I mentioned that not all of the countries have enough vaccines, and it's disproportionately the richer ones that get the vaccines first. But ironically, if you wanted everyone to get out of this pandemic, quickly, you need everyone to get vaccinated. And yeah, that means does that mean that the unknown countries are the ones that are very important in this scenario? Actually, no, because the places that we care the most about right now are those with quite high populations and are not really unknown, but rather just they're quite big, but at the same time they're not the richest countries. So, places like India, Brazil, and some of the Southeast Asian countries aren't getting enough vaccines, and we need them to open because they're still quite influential places to do trade and for globalization and stuff like that. So in the end, it isn't really just the US per se that we have to be worried about, but also places in like the big countries in Asia and the rest of the world. I think maybe in Africa, we'd probably be thinking of South Africa, for example, or like places like that we would be caring about the most. That I would probably say are the influential ones. In other words, I would say developing yet well-known countries. Yeah, so what does that mean? So which actually affects these countries the most? Well, overpopulation does affect some of these countries because they still have pretty high birth rates, but resource distribution is probably the another thing that affects them as well, because it's more of within the country, but some people get access more than others, especially with the vaccines. The overpopulation kind of affects the demand because there's just not enough vaccines for everyone. But distribution affects the fact that only maybe the people who have money or the people who drive the hospitals or get the hospital in time actually get the vaccines. And it's not just vaccines. I think earlier in the year when there were other supplies, especially I've actually seen some videos about the situation in India where things like oxygen tanks and stuff like that were in really high demand, and people were literally waiting in line just to get an oxygen tank, and that was a bit crazy. Yeah, so you can see the problem is maybe there's not enough supply to begin with, actually. And the distribution is also a bit lacking in the sense because they don't have as many times that they can actually go and supply the oxygen tanks. So what does that mean? Is overpopulation or resource distribution the bigger problem here? I think for that you have to consider the time scale as well. But as of now, they are both working together to be a problem. Yeah. So maybe we should take a moment to look at other countries that maybe don't have one of those issues and then see if that affects them. So if you wanted to know which countries actually get vaccinated the most, it's actually places that, okay, not even countries, but more of like those random islands in the middle of the ocean that belong to UK. They have really high vaccination rates because they have a very small population and they're under UK's legislation, so they get the vaccines quite easily. And that actually means that you know they have the best of both worlds. They don't have a huge population and they have the benefit of getting stuff from UK. Yeah, so maybe we have to look at another example. mm, well, I don't know. I guess maybe we could say, for example, I've actually heard that in South Korea they are kind of like a medium-ish country, I guess, but they do not have enough vaccines. So you would think that they actually get enough vaccines, but they don't. Singapore got more vaccines than South Korea. Oh no. Yeah, so it actually probably is the distribution that matters. Oh well. Right. Okay, so yeah, you heard of the news that Singapore recently allowed Australia to have some of the earliest batch of vaccines and instead traded it for the December batch, which I think is a really good gesture because I think we have enough people vaccinated, so yeah, might as well. Yeah, so you can kind of come to the conclusion whether you think it's distribution or overpopulation here, but this is a scenario for this particular point. So the next point, I mean the last point is how fixable or whether we're actually fixing it is the problem. Like, when are we fixing the problem? Can we actually fix the problem? That is the last point. So in this case, overpopulation, as I mentioned, it kind of self-regulates itself to some degree. It is already fixing itself in developed countries in one way because people focus more on working and they don't see the point in having many children, so they only have one kid or they don't even have kids because they realize that the future isn't going to be great. So that sort of thing happens in developed countries. But at the same time, population isn't just dictated by a number of birds. It's also dictated by the number of people dying. And in the developed countries, you have a lot more old people. And that would probably slow the decline of the population in that sense. So, what do you think will happen? Will it get fixed? I guess you can't really, I mean, you probably can't expect it to decline drastically in any near future, but I don't think it's going to increase too much either. So we probably reach like this certain limit as to how much population we can have. I mean, people have been saying that it could probably go for another 3 million more people, but at a certain point of time, there'll be too many people, and that would automatically cause it to self-regulate back to a lower population. And also we have, pandemics to worry about, so that's another problem. Oh well. So as for distribution, this is probably something that is more in our own control because we are the one mandating the system of distribution. As for natural distribution, people are maybe adjusting the route of rivers and lakes and things like that. But there's only so much they can do, and that can create further problems in distribution because maybe if you block the river in this one point, then the people living there suddenly are affected because of that. So that is one thing to consider. But if you're going to talk about the transportation part of distribution, that is quite a bit harder because it is a very complicated, I mean, not really complicated, but just a very complex system. Like, you can understand it, but you have to worry about each and every little detail that's going on in the system. So for context, let me say, okay, let's get some excess food from the US to, let's say, Africa. But saying that is easier than doing. You need to first pack the food properly in US in a way that prevents spoiling and stuff because some foods are acidic, some food that can destroy the container. There's some foods that get moldy very easily and things like that. So you need to consider what kind of food you can pack and what kind of container you can use to pack the food. And you also need materials to make all of these containers and make sure that they are disposed of properly in the destination. And then you need to fly it over to the major airports. And of course, in certain parts of Africa, they're just like staying in an area which is quite isolated or quite remote. They're not very near the airport. So once you reach an airport, you need people to drive it over and maybe even walk the last mile to bring it to people. And that is a lot of logistical stuff. And more importantly, there's a lot of money that's required to do this. And that requires papers to be signed and people to be on board, which I guess is even harder than actually getting the job done. So yeah, I mean, one other solution is to bring seeds that you can plant in the destination location, but that has its own set of problems because maybe the destination doesn't have very fertile land, or that's probably the reason why they don't have enough food to begin with. So that could be a reason. I'm not sure if that's really the reason, or if there's a drought or flood that can destroy the plant entirely. So that is the problem. So how fixable is the problem? Well, population is probably more fixable than the distribution problem at the moment, given the way people behave and how easy it is to convince people to do things like this, because distribution requires a lot more cooperation, I think. Whereas overpopulation is already being, like, the fact that people are already self thinking of not giving birth and things like that is already self perpetuating itself, you know self regulating itself. So are we actually doing these things? Well, um yeah, I guess we are maybe doing some of these things. There are definitely many non-profits that are trying their best to get resources to poor locations and to people who live there. But it's really just, it may not really be enough. It's not really fast enough. And we still have the situation going on. We still have a situation where some people are incredibly rich and have so much of stuff to that they can spend money on. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have incredibly poor people living on less than $1 a day, or even less than that. If who knows? Yeah, so we really are not really doing this fast enough to fix the problem. So there we go. We have looked at all of the four points. Actually, before I end off, let me tell one last thing, which is pop culture references. Maybe you can use this in your intro or something. With regards to fixing the problem. So I'm not sure if you know about this, but in a Dan Brown book, I'm not sure which one was it. I'll put the title on the PowerPoint. So there's one which is about this virus that makes people infertile or something. So like the so-called the antagonist plan was to put this particular virus in a location and flood the location so that people will be infected with the virus, and instead of killing them, it just makes them infertile. And like it's not everyone becomes infertile, but like there's a 50% chance, and that would automatically reduce the number of people in the world. So that was the idea of that story. And of course, if you're a more recent times person, I don't even know if this is considered recent anymore, but Infinity War, the Marvel movies, where with one snap you remove half of the life on Earth or something. Yeah, that's another similar concept of removing some people, um, in order to solve the world's problems. So the funny thing is, I have not watched that movie at all. I've only heard about it through YouTube videos and people analyzing the movie rather than the actual movie, which explains the fact that I'm more aware, or like the first thing that came to my mind was about the author of the Da Vinci Code and another book that he wrote, that because I really like his books, I've read all of them. Then of a highly popular scene that graced many cinemas. Anyways, the point is, you could probably use this if you want to. So in conclusion, yeah, I guess definitely what is worse is both of them happening together. But if you had to choose, I mean, they both influence each other in a way, as we have seen earlier. But if you had to choose one, I feel like resource distribution is the stronger point to put forward as a harder problem, like the more angsty problem to deal with, because it's not just something that requires just one individual to do, but instead you need everyone to, like, be on board with the issue, to be on board with the plan. And also it's something that is, if disturbed by natural forces, can be even harder to solve. Whereas if population growth is disturbed by natural forces, it's actually a good thing for those who want lesser population, in the sense. I mean, I'm not sure if you call it a good thing, but it works in favor of the overpopulation issue rather than working against it. Yeah, so yeah, that's what I think of. But if you think you can actually make an argument out of overpopulation, then go ahead and try it. I am not going to stop you. I don't think this may be a real question, so it's up to you to decide what you want to do. Yeah, so right, I think we're done. I did talk a bit extra, but I think we're still going on good timing. So I hope you found this video useful. If you did, please press the like button and subscribe. And with that, I would like to say thank you and bye.